all across America. Big cities and some even medium-sized cities have seen massive riots, looting, arson, protests, attacks on police, and attacks on citizens. But the attacks on police concern me the most. We have seen at least a dozen police officers who've been murdered in the last couple of months, and this just cannot continue. And yet when some of those cities that have given up control of their own backyards, and they refuse to do the things necessary to stop mobs of rioters from burning and looting and committing other crimes, then they object to the idea that federal law enforcement is brought in to do the job the locals refuse to do. Cully Stimson joins me now, who's a senior legal fellow for Heritage and a manager for the National Security Law Program. Cully, welcome to the program. And can you believe we've actually got cities that won't defend themselves then faulting the president for saying, well, if you won't do it, then we will do it to protect the rights and the safety of your own citizens?
Yeah, Lars, thanks for having me. It's a political Houdini act that's not working because, as we've discussed before, the states enjoy police power. The mayors and the governors have the primary responsibility under their state constitution and laws to enforce the law as written. And so it takes a lot of chutzpah to try to blame the president for the riots and the mayhem and the looting and the arson and the thievery and the rest of it, when, in fact, this predated George Floyd, certainly in Portland. And so it's not working, and I don't think the American people are buying it.
No, the left-wing thuggery has been going on literally for years. I mean, because I'm very close to it, because my studios are normally, when I'm not doing them from my home studios because of the China virus, the studios are about a block and a half from where Occupy set up camp for a couple of months, one of the biggest Occupies in America, and they did millions of dollars of damage, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in police overtime, and then came the Antifa riots, and then came the BLM protests that also turned violent toward the police and toward citizens. So to say this is something new that only occurred when, the Federal Protective Service, the Marshal Service, and the Customs and Border Protection showed up, it's just absurd. It's not backed up by the facts. But the mayor of the city is a Stanford and Harvard educated guy, and maybe that's the problem, Stanford and Harvard, that he says, we had it under control. He'd had 40-plus nights of open violence that he stood up and told the police, stand down, don't do anything, basically just contain them, the way Obama used to contain ISIS. Yes, you can have this part of the territory, and we'll let you do whatever you want within it. That seemed to be his approach.
Well, Stanford and Harvard are great institutions. I would recommend to the distinguished mayor of taking a Hillsdale College Constitution 101 course by Larry Arnn, and you might learn something about his duties and responsibilities under state law, which he's clearly failing, as are many other mayors who are failing to enforce the laws written. Look, if you don't want to lead, leave office and let somebody else step up. I mean, I noticed your tweet today, and I follow you on Twitter. It's a great Twitter feed, and you reported a story about the police chief down in Dallas, who is an African-American woman, and she said, by the way, folks, if you block a road here in this city, I'm going to arrest you. And, of course, these knuckleheads went out and did that, and she arrested over 700 of them. And then when the press was trying to excoriate her in a press conference afterwards, she said, look, I told people what I was going to do. I did what I did, and I'm not here to make people happy. I'm here to enforce the law. It'd be nice if people in Portland had a police chief like that, and I suspect you have a lot of law enforcement officers at the local level in Portland who want to enforce the law, but the mayor and the socialists who are running the government aren't giving them the green light to do just that.
Well, and Cully, I've said, people have said, well, you can't arrest all those people. I said, you really don't have to. The IRS doesn't have to audit everybody. They audit 1%, and everybody else runs around in great fear of the IRS. So if you take the approach, and some of it is fear of being held to the law. If Seattle, when CHOP was going on, said, we're going to go in, and if you decide to break the law by blocking streets, by taking over buildings, we're going to pull out a big box of zip cuffs, and we're going to zip cuff people and load them onto onto city buses. They could do the same thing in Portland, and it would be legal, it would be constitutional to say, if you break the law, we will take you into custody. And then have the buses drive off to the most far distant police precinct you can find within the jurisdiction and cut people loose and say, tomorrow night we'll do the same trip if that's what you want to do. That, I think, would go a long ways, and it would all be legitimate, it would be lawful, and be constitutional. You're the senior legal fellow at Heritage. Has anything I've suggested, or does anything I suggest, break either the law or the Constitution?
No, you remember back in March I granted you an honorary law degree, so I think you're right on.
Thank you.
And you know, there's another question that's brewing out there, and people are acting like, oh gosh, the commander-in-chief was also the chief law enforcement officer of the country. He has no right to activate federal troops to go into Portland. Of course, there's federal property in Portland. There are federal personnel in Portland and other cities, and they have absolutely not only the right, but I would argue the duty to protect that. You can't let a mob burn down the federal courthouse or burn down the marshal's office or burn down the U.S. attorney's office. That's ridiculous. And so, you know, of course the president is the chief law enforcement officer, and of course he has to act in a proportional way, and the rules of engagement have to be very clear for those federal officers because the states have the primary responsibility to enforce the law, but the mayor and others aren't giving them the green light to enforce the law. I hope the people in Portland are waking up. I hope the business owners and the minority business owners and the residents of the inner city who aren't so-called woke people are waking up to realize that these hoodlums are burning down the city and the mayor is a complete failure.
Okay, since I have that honorary degree from the Cully Stimson Law Institute, let me go out on a limb here, because one of the things I've noticed is that when Arkansas decades ago said we're not going to let brown and black students go to schools, the federal government said you can't do that. We're going to enforce the law. And people look back on that with pride. They mentioned Little Rock, you know, and we solved that problem. If you have a city that's beset by these kinds of demonstrations, it doesn't just affect the shop that's burned down or the shop that gets destroyed to the federal property. Every other person who has a legitimate right to go to any American city, take a stroll, eat dinner at a restaurant, whatever you want to do, is now scared to death to come to that part of these big cities like Seattle, like Portland, like Chicago, where they can't do it without fearing they may run into one of these crowds and end up being collateral damage to what goes on. It seems to me, maybe I couldn't make the case in court, but it seems to me that that's a violation of my civil rights, isn't it?
Well, you get what you pay for that law degree, Lars, by the way. And I think the analogy sort of falls apart. I mean, in the post-Brown v. Board of Education era, people were enforcing federal civil rights laws. Here, the state has the primary responsibility to enforce good order and discipline and the laws on the books. The federal government has a much more limited role. So unless they're triggering federal civil rights or other violations, I think really the job falls on the shoulder of the state and the local authorities, and the federal government would come in as a last resort,
and if they won't do it,
distinct and proportional way. Right.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to have to hang my law degree backwards on the wall now.
I'll keep it. Just keep it, yeah.
Well, it really troubles me that you've made certain downtowns around America I don't know why anybody would voluntarily go anywhere near that, and I think it's hurting an awful lot of people. Cully, I appreciate your expertise and what you do at Heritage. Thanks for the time.
Thanks for having me.
You betcha. That's Cully Stimson from the Heritage Foundation, manager of the National Security Law Program.